Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us on this seminar tonight on gender-based violence in development projects. My name is, as most of you know, Anna Hartmann, and I'm Stephen Muller Professor at SAIS Europe. Many of you, I think, are my students from last semester, but presently I speak to you from Berlin. Now, let me quickly introduce to you Imrana Jalal, who is our speaker tonight. Imrana Jalal is presently chair of the World Bank Inspection Panel, which, as you know, the World Bank is headquartered in Washington, D.C., and she speaks to us today from Washington, Imrana. But Imrana is actually a nationality of a faraway country, namely Fiji. And there she's very known, or she's a very known person, as I found out over the last years in the Pacific region. By training, Imrana is a development specialist and a lawyer. But she's known as a very engaged international human rights lawyer and activist, gender expert and activist. She has founded a number of human rights institutions in the Pacific region. She was the first human rights commissioner in the initial Fiji Human Rights Commission, the first of its kind in the Pacific region. She's a member of a jurist commission in Geneva. She's an author of a textbook on law for Pacific women, a legal rights handbook. And very importantly, she's the architect of the Fiji Family Law Act, which gave equal rights to women. But clearly she was so effective in her work as human rights activist and a lawyer that in 2010 she just needed to leave, or decided it was important to leave Fiji due to prosecution by the Fiji military, which had taken over the government in 2006. By that time, she moved to the ADB as a gender expert, but very importantly, since 2018, she's a member and now the chair of the World Bank Inspection Panel in Washington, D.C. So thank you so much, Imrana, for joining us. But before I hand over to you, let me just say a couple of sentences about what is the inspection panel. And those of you who attended my classes in fall probably know that, because we actually simulated a case on an inspection panel type case. But let me just, to all of our participants tonight, explain what the inspection panel is. It is a body independent from the World Bank, but part of the governance structures, where affected people can submit complaints and say, we have been harmed, or I've been harmed, or I think I have been harmed by a project financed by the World Bank, and the World Bank has not adhered to its policies, and most of the cases relate to environmental and social questions. And more recently, and that's the case why I mentioned it, also on gender-based violence. And Imrana will talk today about two of those cases which very prominently were submitted to the World Bank Inspection Panel. The World Bank Inspection Panel is very special. It was the first mechanism of its kind, and all the other development finance institutions followed suit, have similar mechanisms today, and we can clearly assume that whatever the decisions were taken by the inspection panel on gender-based violence will also set precedents and have impacts on the other mechanisms. Now, let me just quickly say, first, Imrana will give a presentation, and then we will have obviously questions and answers. I want to ask the participant to pose their questions on the Q&A function. Please do not pose it on the chat. So please post your questions on the Q&A function, and please identify yourself. So thank you so much, Imrana, for making yourself available and to speak to us on this important subject. Over to you.
Thank you, Anna. It's such a privilege to be invited by you in particular, as somebody who is a colleague, not just in terms of development, but a highly respected development professional who works at the World Bank, and who yourself was on our equivalent, the Asian Development Bank equivalent of the inspection panel. And it's just wonderful to be your guest and the guests guest of Johns Hopkins University. Thank you so much for inviting me. So I'm going to ask my colleague Rupesh to put our slides up on the screen. It's a fairly intense topic, and so sometimes, although I won't speak literally to the PowerPoint, it's very useful, I think, if you see some of the information in the data. Thank you. Rupesh, the next slide, please. So what we know, of course, while Rupesh is getting the slide up, is that the WHO, in partnership with lots of local health organizations, have done massive surveys. And in fact, last year, they re-released the same report, thinking that the data would have changed, but it hasn't. So we know through the research done by WHO that roughly 1/3 of women have experienced physical or sexual violence. Of those women, 7% have reported sexual assaults by someone other than their partner. And so this is obviously very, very concerning. And only 7% of those who experience gender-based violence actually report that incident to the police or justice agency. And the most common reason for women and girls not reporting violence against them is that they fear that they won't be believed. Now, so one thing that's always concerned me is if 1/3 of women are saying globally that they have experienced violence against them, and it's not just normal violence, it's gendered violence, which is a very specific form of violence. It's not like normal violence. Then what are the men saying? Because that's a pretty horrific statistic, isn't it? 1 in 3. So in 2013, the UNDP did this study of 10,000 men in Asia and the Pacific region, which is the region that I come from. And they were asked on the basis of confidentiality and anonymity to respond to a survey. Now, this is what the 10,000 men said. The data is actually quite horrifying. The numbers of men who admitted to using violence against women were between 26% for the country with the lowest data to 80% with the country with the highest data. And this is across the whole Asia Pacific region. Nearly 1/4 of the 10,000 men reported perpetrating rape against women and girls. And the country range was between 10% and 62%. 4% of that 25% said that they had participated in gang rape. And between 72% and 97% said that there were no legal consequences. They were not prosecuted, they didn't have to go to court, they weren't questioned, and they weren't prosecuted in a court of law and imprisoned. So this is very, very, very concerning. And when they were asked, and remember this is all on the basis of anonymity, when they were asked, why do you do this? I mean, what is the basis of your belief? What is your belief that thinks that you can get away with this? And they said it was sexual entitlement, a belief that it was their right. So this is very concerning, obviously. Now, we know what the impact is. I'm not going to talk about all the psychological impact and so on. You've seen enough documentaries, you've read enough data to know how the consequences are very, very serious for the women themselves and the girls concerned, right? But in 2012, the World Development Report on Gender Equality said one of the most concerning things was the intergenerational impact of violence against women. So if boys see their fathers committing violence, they will perpetrate it on the women in their family and their wives and their spouses and their partners, so on. So that intergenerational impact is of great concern to all of us, and it should be if we are concerned about development. Next slide. Thank you, Rupesh. Now, so this is just to give you an example of some of the testimonies that we collected in the 2 investigations that the World Bank did, which I will share with you later on. And I'm not going to read this out. I'm just putting it up on the screen so you can see the kinds of impact that it had on women and the development projects that we looked at. I will just quote you one, and this is the 4th one, where the woman had to leave the job in the end. She said, I was told that if I did not have sex with the supervisor, I would be fired. He would grope me, grabbing my genitalia and breasts, often in the kitchen or in the pantry. I also saw the supervisor and other foreign workers groping other female workers and making hand gestures that implied sex and thrusting their pelvises while saying chica chica. I spent the night at the camp and was summoned to the supervisor's room. I was told I must have sex with him. I did not consent. He refused to wear a condom. I was later diagnosed with an STD from the rape at the work camp. I was required to take an HIV test. And by the way, the men were not required to take an HIV test, only the women at the camp. I worked for less than a month and was not paid for my time. I am now ostracized and ridiculed by the community. Next slide. So that's the human toll. What is the economic cost? And the reason I'm focusing on this is that I work for Multilateral Development Bank. Hundreds and thousands and millions of dollars are poured into development. We build roads, we build dams, we build hospitals, we support agriculture, water, and so on and so forth. Now, everything we do has a beneficial impact to women. There is no question about it. If you provide women with pipes in their kitchen, you reduce their time poverty because they don't have to walk to the well to collect money. They've gained an hour of time in their day. So there's no question that the banks do excellent work and the impact of their work on women is considerable. But in addition to that, women suffer sometimes a gendered harm, a gendered cost, and that is gender-based violence. So in persuading development banks and development agencies to change the way they approach project design, one has to show them what the economic cost is, because it's like pouring money down a well if you don't use the money wisely. And the research by Care International, which is the most recent organization to have done considerable research, shows that violence against women can cost countries up to 3.7% of their gross domestic product, more than twice what most governments spend on education. And if you looking at it from a global perspective, the cost is 2% of the global GDP, which is equivalent to the economy of Canada. And of course, when you're looking at it in terms of women in the labor market, although we have not done costing studies on sexual harassment, there are some country studies to indicate what it costs the labor market. And we know that in the developing world in particular, and I know this is global, but I'm more familiar with the developing world, that it is one of the reasons why women either leave paid work and they go back to doing unpaid work at the home, or they do not enter the market, the paid labor market, because their husbands won't allow them, or they themselves fear experiencing sexual harassment when they are at work. Thank you, Rupesh. Now, just in case I've given you the impression that this is only a problem at the multilateral development banks, that is not true. And I think you've all seen the media, which has covered quite extensively what happened with Oxfam International. In 2018, Oxfam had a safeguarding crisis where it was eventually found that, and this is something that disturbs me greatly, that during a time when most humans are so vulnerable, which is after a disaster, that is when they are abused. So, you know, this is just not acceptable at any level. Now, in that case, when Oxfam did its investigation, what they found was Oxfam staff and contractors had committed sexual misconduct. Now, Oxfam, it shook Oxfam to its core, as you can imagine, because Oxfam is an excellent, admirable organization, and they had to establish an independent accountability mechanism, much like the World Bank Inspection Panel. In 2019, the Worldwide Fund for Nature launched an investigation into claims that the money that it was providing for projects actually equipped paramilitary forces to sexually assault and torture people, including murder, in the national parks across Africa and Asia. Again, WWF has had to establish a new grievance mechanism to deal with the allegations of gender-based violence. So this WWF's new mechanism not only allows project affected people to complain about the implementation of its projects, but it also allows project affected people to ask general questions about the project. And then UNDP has an accountability mechanism called SECU, a Social and Environmental Compliance Unit. They had to deal with a project in Malawi where UNDP funded the registration, national registration of people to give people identity cards. And in that project, the complaint was by female registration officers who were part of the project and were trying to register people's identities. In that project, the girls and women who were participating in the project were not treated in a gender-specific way. Their vulnerabilities were not taken into account, and the young girls ended up having to sleep in the same room as male registration officers. So obviously there were consequences to that. There was a complaint filed to UNDP SECU, and SECU found that the UNDP had violated its own gender policy by not looking at the potential gender issues in the project, and they had not designed the project in a way to accommodate the specific kinds of women. Next slide, please. Now, Anna has explained to you well what the inspection panel does. The inspection panel has comparable institutions in about 20 to 21 different international financial institutions. Anna's worked at the ADB one, as you heard, and she also is part of one of the European IAMs. So it's very important that the accountability mechanisms like ours are equipped with the proper tools in order to do the investigation. And that can be a problem if we don't have specific gender policies with which to measure harm against. So some IAMs have good gender policies and people can file a complaint based on the gender policies. In the World Bank, we don't have a specific gender policy, although we don't have a gender-specific operational policy. We have a human resources gender policy, but not an operational gender policy. However, the World Bank does have a gender strategy, but the social and environmental framework allows people to complain and make general complaints. And you will see later on that despite the fact that we don't have a gender policy, the inspection panel was able to do the investigation under a general financing policy. So at this point, what I want to highlight is that international accountability mechanisms are not courts of law, right? So we can't question governments, we can't cross-examine perpetrators of those who commit violence against women in development projects. But what we can do is we can investigate, find the harm, and report to the borrowing government that this has taken place and that the problems need to be addressed. And in some circumstances, what we've found is because women do not want to go to a court of law, because I'm sure you know all the consequences of what happens to women in the courts of law and in justice agencies, which is why they don't want to report it. And I shared that with you in the first slide. So IAMs are at least a form of accountability of some sort. Next slide, please. So now we're getting into the cases that the inspection panel did. So there were two cases. There was a case in Uganda in 2016 where an organization called Joy for Children filed a claim of harm committed in a range of ways, but I'm only going to look at the gender-based violence. I'm not going to look at the other harms alleged, like claims for compensation and environmental harms and so on. Now, the perpetrators were road workers working for the foreign company, and they were also foreign workers, as well as men who'd been brought in from other neighboring countries to supplement the labor force. There was child sexual abuse reported, sexual exploitation by offering money and small gifts in exchange for sex. There was, some of the consequences were a high dropout rate from school and teenage pregnancies and so on. Now, I just want to skip to the next slide and I'll come back to this slide. Rupesh, if you could just show the next slide. I just want to give you an example of the lack of gender sensitivity in the entire project design. but not only in the project design, but also the way that the complaint was dealt with. So the World Bank sent staff into the area to see if, in fact, sexual violence had been committed against the girls. And this is how they conducted the meeting, the investigation to start off with. They asked for a meeting in the village hall, and it was combined, men and women, the chief, you know, so on and so forth. And the staff got up and said, please stand up and tell your story if you have been sexually assaulted. And of course, in this context, nobody was going to stand up and say, well, actually, I'm a victim of rape. So you can go back to the previous slide, Rupesh. And so the World Bank came back to the inspection panel and management and said there was no sexual violence being committed in the community. They had asked the community, and nobody had stood up and said that they had been sexually violated. So we, of course, when we went in, subsequently, gender specialists and gender-based violence specialists were sent in by the bank after our investigation began. And of course, with the use of gender expertise, they found quite widespread sexual violence committed against women and girls, and especially against the young school-age girls. So what was wrong? What, from a development approach, what did not happen, which ought to have happened right at the due diligence stage when the project was being designed? There was no gender analysis. There was no gender expertise on the project design team. There was no gender expertise in the due diligence team. The local NGOs were not asked, are there any specific gendered issues we should look at? We're going to bring in hundreds of men into this region. We want to know, do you think there's going to be a problem? So there was no assessment done. There was no looking at, well, what is the impact of bringing in all these foreigners and these men from other countries? And there was no consultation. There was no operational grievance redress mechanisms. So generally in a situation like this, there ought to have been a project-based grievance mechanism where the women and families could have gone and complained to, and then something could have been done about it. So our investigation found all these harms. The result was the bank canceled the project in December 2015, and UNRWA, which is the Uganda Roads Authority, committed to addressing all the problems and redesigning the project, which they then took over they took over the project because the bank had cancelled its funds. And they, to their credit, have done a lot of work since 2016 to try to address those problems. And then, of course, in 2016-17, we had another, next slide, please, Rupesh. So look, I just want to say that it's important for you to know that the crimes against women were not committed by bank staff. Mm-hmm. So this was not like Oxfam, in which staff and employees and consultants committed the crimes against the women. In both the Uganda case and the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo case, World Bank staff were not involved. These were staff, these were employees of the contracting company, which had contracted with the government to build the road. Okay, so it's important for you to know that. I just want to give you a very, very, very quick snapshot of how we conducted the investigations in both Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. We used what is called a survivor-centric method, which places the victims at the center. We used focus group discussions. We used experts. We took in experts who were able to deal with the issue with sensitivity. I often say, and I spent part of my life being a prosecutor, that in fact, that the evidence that was collected by the inspection panel staff was worthy of a prosecution. I would have taken evidence like that. It was more than sufficient to establish a prima facie case, which is enough evidence to mount a prosecution, and I would have gone with it had I been a prosecutor in that case. So there was no question of whether or not we collected sufficient evidence. True, we did not bring the perpetrators before us and cross-examine. That's not our role. Our role is not to establish beyond reasonable doubt that a crime had occurred. Our role was to establish whether or not, given the evidence, which was corroborated by the community, by other girls, similar fact evidence, was it sufficient on the balance of probability to say that the women had been sexually assaulted? And we very comfortably found that there was sufficient evidence. Next slide. So, you know, again, in a very similar situation, and to be fair to the World Bank, this case happened while the World Bank was developing all its responses to what had happened. So this case, the complaint came to us before the World Bank had put in all their new standards and their new guidelines and so on and so forth to make sure that future projects the same thing did not happen. Now, what was different about this case? Two main things, because the same shortcomings were there. There were no gender analysis, no gender expertise, no consultation with local women. They had not done a proper assessment of the risks, the social risks that would occur. Was two things. First of all, as you know, the DRC is a fragile, conflict and violence affected country. So if you compare it to Uganda, you have to put on an even more objective lens, a stronger social lens to look at the situation, because clearly in a country where there's conflict and violence, there's going to be an even higher risk of gender-based violence. And the second thing that was different in comparison to the Uganda case is the existence of the military, the existence of security forces in the area. Now, just as an aside, the DRC is consistently ruled by various studies to be one of the 10 most dangerous countries in the world for women, along with Afghanistan, Sudan, and a number of other countries. Now, you would think that the social scientists who were helping in designing this project would think, oh my goodness, we're going to bring in labor from the outside. This is a fragile and conflicted country. There's the presence of security forces, military, militia, and local militia that is actually not run by the state, but also run by warlords in the area. But that analysis was not done. And what happened in this case is the presence of the military security forces created a climate of intimidation and fear. So women were even less reluctant to complain about what had happened to them. And what the presence of the security forces did was created an enabling environment for the gender-based violence to happen. In many cases, the security forces themselves committed the rape of women. In other cases, security forces guarded the door while foreign staff raped women and girls inside the room. So they were guarding so nobody else would come in. So, you know, this taught the World Bank and the other MDBs, I should say, a huge and important lesson that when we go into countries like this, we have to be very careful. There's a high risk of gender-based violence, and we have to assess that in our project design. Next slide, please. And I'm coming to the last two slides. So one of the challenges of development projects in remote areas, but in fact, not just in remote areas, even in urban areas, because I used to work at the Asian Development Bank, and even in urban areas where we were building, mass rapid transport, right in the heart of the urban areas, you would still have sex trafficking. But a little bit differently, in urban areas, gender-based violence occurs within the context of organized crime. While in the rural areas, it's more likely than not that it's random gender-based violence committed by staff, contractor staff or employees. That's one of the difference between the context of gender-based violence in urban and rural settings. So when you're bringing in a large labor influx, obviously there's a huge risk. And so as a result of that, the World Bank has developed a labor influx guideline, where they do things like they try to reduce labor influx by employing local workers. They look very carefully at the contextual factors, the legal and policy framework. They develop special labor plans, management plans in consultation with local NGOs and communities to try to mitigate the consequences of it. Next slide, please. Now, I must stress here what a transformative impact these two cases have had on the World Bank. It shook the foundations of the World Bank to its core. It was reported on all the international media. The World Bank board, which is 25 members representing 190 odd countries, were united that management had to address this. They were very concerned that not only were the women suffering as a result of World Bank projects, but also, of course, there was a huge reputational risk to the World Bank. And it meant that all multilateral development banks, all international financial institutions could learn a lesson from what had happened at the World Bank. So there were incredible changes. There was a global gender-based violence task force set up consisting of World Bank staff, consisting of those who are not in the World Bank, who are experts and so on. And through them, there were a range of guidance notes developed which are compulsory. So when project staff are designing a project where all these factors coexist, high rates of poverty, high rates of gender-based violence, the existence of conflict and fragile and conflict affected countries, the existence of high rates of gender-based violence combined with a labor influx, security forces and so on, automatically there's a risk assessment tool which World Bank staff who are involved in the project must apply, that risk screening tool of sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment, and they have to develop gender responsive designs which have to be integrated into the project. We now have special grievance mechanisms if there's a high risk of gender-based violence, and those grievance mechanisms are staffed with gender-based violence experts. We have conditions in our recruitment of contracting companies that they must get the staff to sign a code of conduct. Every individual staff must receive training and they must sign a code of conduct. Otherwise, literally, they will not get the contract from the World Bank and the government. And there's a good practice note on addressing violence in project financing involving major civil works. So, as you can see, the World Bank has gone out of its way to develop these excellent responses. And as somebody who considers themselves knowledgeable about gender, I would say that the World Bank has done everything it possibly can, at least in terms of institutional changes, to make sure these changes occur. If you were to ask me whether this has changed the attitudes of people who work at the World Bank, I can't say for sure, but I can tell you that objectively they have to apply all these tools and all these guidance notes, and they have to apply the new environmental and social framework rules, which altogether ensures that the gender designs are there. So it doesn't mean that violence against women won't happen in development projects. They will happen, but the question is, what have the IFIs done to mitigate the possibility of it happening? Next slide, please. So these were the key takeaways. These were the main messages that we have taken from these investigations, and we have a gender-based violence publication, and I'll share the visual of it in a minute. But these are some of the lessons that we hope that the World Bank and other IFIs have learned from our investigation. First of all, you have to do gender diagnostics. You cannot ignore the importance of gender diagnostics. You have to do a gender analysis and the gender-based violence analysis where there's a high risk of it happening. We have to remember that if we're spending millions of dollars funding a road project, but women are bearing the gendered cost of that road project, then that's too high a price to pay. And that means we have to be particularly careful to make sure that gender-based violence action plans become an integral part of the project documents and project design. Automatically, we should know low levels of gender equality, high rates of gender-based violence, an influx of male construction workers, poor rule of law contexts, impunity from prosecution. I shared with you the data about how 72 to 97% of men have gotten away with committing violence against women with no legal consequences. So if we call that impunity from prosecution. And if it's a fragile conflict and violence affected area, these are all early warning signs of the high risk of project-related gender-based violence. International accountability mechanisms like ours provide a safe space for women to complain, especially if they don't want to go to the police, recognizing the fact that half of the borrower countries do not score high in the rule of law index. There is an important need for survivor-centered investigation. You know, I shared with you the data about why women don't report rape. They don't report rape because they think no one's going to believe them. So we have to start off on the assumption that what they're saying is the truth. They are telling the truth. That is the assumption in the beginning, not they're not telling the truth. You start off on the assumption that they are telling the truth, and then you collect the evidence. And if they're not telling the truth, the evidence will tell you that. While most investigations previously started off on the basis of non-belief. So that's a really important tip that I would like to share with you. And of course, if you provide accountability for gender-based violence, what you're doing is you're providing accountability for development. The IFIs are huge institutions, gargantuan institutions with enormous power. We have enormous power. So our power must be used wisely and prudently and carefully. The lesson being that if we want to avoid women suffering more than they have to in terms of gender-based violence, we need to design our projects in such a way that it mitigates the risk of gender-based violence. And the final slide, just to give you an idea of our gender-based violence publication, you can download our report, which more or less shares with you what I've just shared with you, but of course in greater detail. And it focuses on the intricacies of the cases we investigated. And I would urge you to download it and flick through it. And of course, if you want to look at our website, there's our website address. And I think I'll end there, and I hope I've kept within my 40 minutes, or yes, I have. I've got 6 minutes left, Anna. And yes. I think I'll stop there, and I'm happy to receive questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Imrana. And not only did you keep within your time limit, you were also very lively, and I mean, lots of leading us into the life of investigations and on these panels and with all the challenges. And let me just say, questions most welcome, and please put those in the Q&A facility, and please identify yourself. Now we have a long question, Imrana. I start with the end. It's from Zachary Nelson, who is one of the students with some experience in the field. We work in Bologna right now. So thank you, Zachary, for asking the question. I start with the final question, and then afterwards I give the introduction. His question is, how do grievance redress mechanisms focus on gender? For example, sexual assault, how can you measure success and efficacy of these project-based grievance mechanism? And what in your view constitutes a successful grievance mechanism? I think that's particularly important given the sensitivities around the issues and the unlikeliness of people to speak up. As a background to this, and it's in the Q&A function addressed to everybody, Zachary sort of says, it's very fashionable to have these grievance mechanisms in the multilaterals, in the bilaterals, in the CSOs, but often they're only box-ticking exercises. They're really not meant to be serious. So here his final question is, how do you make sure they work and what constitutes a successful mechanism? So over to you.
That's a very challenging question. Now, I assume, Zachary, that you are asking about the grievance mechanisms placed in the project itself. You're not asking about the World Bank. You're not asking about the IFI's accountability mechanisms, which Anna and I work for. I'm assuming. Okay, yes.
That's my assumption.
Yes, and I think that that's a fair question. So the World Bank used to only have grievance mechanisms in certain situations. For example, in cases involving Indigenous people or resettlement, there had to be a project-based grievance mechanism. Now, in the context of gender-based violence, grievance mechanisms are compulsory. So the World Bank has had to do that. So it's no longer optional in situations like this, whether or not to have a grievance mechanism. But I agree with you. I mean, I've now worked in 2 banks, and I know that often in that remote area of a country where the project's being run, there are people who probably don't turn up and so on. But I would argue that in the context of gender-based violence, if you have a gender person, a gender specialist in the grievance mechanism, and remember, these are special mechanisms, okay, gender-based violence mechanisms, I would argue that a gender person will not treat this as a tick box exercise. Now, I can't say for sure because there hasn't been much time has passed. We don't have the data and the analysis to tell you whether, as a result of our project investigations, all these changes happened, we are now successful. I can't say that because we haven't, these new guidelines, these new assessment tools have not been around that long. But I think in 5 or 6 years, we will be able to make the assessment. Now, as far as I know, the people that I know, the women I know and the people I know who are social development specialists, specializing in gender-based violence, do not ignore complaints about gender-based violence. It's taken extremely seriously. Now, how do we measure success? In the Uganda case, the girls were, the community decided to be open about it, so people knew who the girls were. It wasn't hidden anymore. As a result of a World Bank funded project, the girls received training for livelihoods. They were given medical support. Those who wanted to go to court, and only one or two went to court, and only in one case was there a successful prosecution where the offender was in prison for 4 years. And, you know, those girls who did no longer wanted to live in the community, not just in Uganda, but in DRC, in the Congo, they were given help to move away from the community. I know this is not ideal. In fact, it's poor, but you have to allow women to have their own agency. So if that's what they chose, you have to respect that. So I would say in the Uganda case, the outcome was quite successful because the girls were given new livelihoods, etc., and they were given help with their babies and so on. Because remember, there were babies born. And, you know, in the context of this community, there were a number of babies born who were of mixed race. And so these babies were very identifiable, as were the girls identifiable. And the social cohesion in the community is really affected when you have these babies who are clearly, whose fathers are from a different country. So I'm not going to gloss over anything, Zachary. I'm not going to say that there's perfect solutions. There's only imperfect solutions, in the same way that women who are victims of violence in a non-development, in a completely unrelated way, none of them have effective solutions either. But I would say that an effective solution is when the World Bank supports the victims of gender-based violence and allows them to choose what they want to do and provides support for those choices.
Mm-hmm. Well, Imrana, before I go to the next question, I also just want to chime in with an experience I had in Africa. I traveled for 10 days all around Tanzania from one construction site to the other, and for a big road project financed by the African Development Bank and others. And the head of the construction ministry, I said, what's your biggest worry about that? So of course I expected procurement issues, corruption, not the right asphalt, delays, God knows what. And she said, no, I am so worried about rape and how the girls are treated in this, because it destroys our communities. And we have all these hundreds and hundreds of workers here. And our communities just don't tolerate that. And it really can destroy not only the life of these people, these women, but also the cohesion of the community. Now, that was quite shocking to me, but it also signals that if one puts the right instruments in place and empowers them with, for example, endorsement and visibility by institutions like the World Bank and others, one has the opportunities to draw attention to it and also constrain it, because, you know, these contractors want to get other contracts. And if something goes wrong and the community feels empowered and protected, that can actually have quite an impact. I just wanted to chime in on that. But now
Thank you, Anna. I just wanted to say that late last year, the World Bank has come down very hard on contractors who've committed these atrocities in other contexts as well. So you have to actually prove that you are a company who has had no aspersions cast on them for gender-based violence. And if you do commit gender-based violence, then you have to go through a series, you know, there's a possibility you'll never get a contract from the World Bank again. So, you know, it's about money, isn't it, Anna? I mean, it's about money. Contractors care about getting contracts and making an income. And if you pass the burden to them to make sure that their staff, that their employees behave themselves, then I think that's a shared risk. But also it is up, I mean, I just want to go back to one point I forgot to make with you, Zachary, which is World Bank staff and all IFI staff have to supervise the implementation of the project. Money comes in tranches and they have to supervise. So they have to supervise the local grievance mechanism to make sure that the mechanism is functioning, that it's staffed with good people, and they have to record this in their reports. And now, because there's such a huge lens on gender-based violence, those reports are very closely monitored and looked at.
Okay, Imrana, I'm reading you a question by Snaha Snakeya. I'm sorry, I probably mispronounced the name. How do the governments respond to the panel's findings on the harm caused and verified in this case? So how did the governments respond? Then, and second point, how else can IFIs influence national enforcement and protection actions by the funds receiving governments apart from stopping fundings? I mean, I guess the other question is what kind of leverage do institutions, IFIs, have over governments in case, you know, they find non-application of those policies, in this case, gender-based policies?
It's a very, very interesting question. So, but first, let me clarify that the World Bank Inspection Panel, in the same way as many other independent accountability mechanisms, we cannot investigate borrower governments. So when we went into Uganda and DRC or in any other complaint, we don't make findings against the borrower government. We make findings against the World Bank. So we measure, the standards that we measure are the standards contained in our policies. So if you go to our report, you'll see comments like the inspection panel finds that the World Bank violated policy on the environmental harms or social harms. So we don't investigate the borrowers and we don't make findings against the borrowers. But it is true that I'm trying to think, the word we use in Fiji is called mana. Mana is the closest explanation is I suppose it's leverage, it's influence, it's credibility. The World Bank has enormous leverage. And when it canceled the project in Uganda, it reverberated through the country. UNRWA literally transformed itself. It's got institutional guidelines There's a woman who's the head of UNRWA now. In the DRC, the project was suspended and then reinstated when the Congo government was able to show that it was implementing a number of measures to reduce the possibility of gender-based violence occurring again. Then the World Bank reinstated the funds, suspended the project and reinstated the funds. Now, your question was, how can we transform or change institutions? I really urge you to go to our gender-based violence publication, because in that publication is a whole section on how the government of Uganda, the road sector, of course, transport sector, changed itself and how it transformed itself. So we do have the capacity, and that leverage is not often used in a public way that you can see. A lot of this happens behind closed door in the corridors of power. And the influence is exerted that way. Now, I'm not saying that we are always successful, but the last thing the World Bank wants, the very, very last thing a borrower wants is to have the inspection panel come into their country. They fear it and they get very concerned about it. And usually what happens, as soon as the complaint is received by an independent accountability mechanism, whether it's the inspection panel or the Asian Development Bank, whatever, changes start occurring immediately, even before we investigate. Often by the time we go to investigate, half of the measures have been implemented without us making a finding of harm. Of course, that doesn't mean that we don't actually say it. We do. We still say the harm occurred. The World Bank was in breach of policy ABC. So I hope I've answered that. I know it's not a completely satisfactory answer, and the World Bank is learning. It's constantly learning. It's a learning institution, and one of the impact of inspection panel investigations is that the institution changes and a whole lot of new measures are implemented. Thank you.
And Imrana, there's a related question by Naisa Ayuya. Again, apologies for mispronouncing the name. Once the panel has done the investigation and passed the recommendation to the bank management, it's to the bank board, how does the panel ensure that these recommendations are taken up by the bank before or along with the project implementation? Over to you.
That's an excellent question. And of course,
and a very excellent question. We battle with that all the time.
Very intuitive and very insightful question. So, until recently, the World Bank Inspection Panel did not have the authority to go back and look at whether or not management had done what it said it would do as a result of our investigation. So this is what happens sequentially. The World Bank, the inspection panel does its investigation. We submit our investigation report to the board. Management has to develop what is called a management action plan. And that management action plan is a response to the findings of social and environmental harm. And it says what management will do to provide a solution, to provide a remedy, to provide redress. Now, for the 28 years since the inspection panel has been in existence, we have not been allowed to go back to check whether or not management did what it said it would do. In Anna's mechanisms that she's involved in, they have the power to do that already and have had for a number of years. We have just engaged in a 3-year-long reform process, a review process, where we asked the World Bank Board to give us the authority to go back and monitor the management action plan. And on September the 8th, 2020, we were finally given the authority to do that. So now, in answer to your question, we can go back. In certain cases, not in all cases, we still have to get the approval of the World Bank Board, and we can go back and check and we can file a report to the board and say, actions number 1 to 5 have been done really well. Actions 6 to 9 have not been done or only done partially. So I think that that's a very direct response to your question.
Okay, let me just complement to that, since I work on that in other mechanisms who have a much broader authority to actually look and check. In the mechanisms I'm involved, we can go and check, but we are very often find, or unfortunately not infrequently find, that the recommendations are not fully implemented. And important is all of this plays out in the public domain. And if there are interests which says we want to have this change, then the likelihood, political interest in the shareholders, let's say in Germany, public interest groups, or in Great Britain or United States, the chance that something happens is much, much bigger, because these shareholders are the owners of the institution, they sit on the board. So this is why these reports which Imrana reported on, and the big interest these cases have, is important, because they were widely publicized, position was taken, and if that happens in the shareholder communities, in the political systems, the pressure on the management is more significant, that something will be done and that you are careful. So it's an interplay between, not only between the bureaucratic mechanisms, the whole instruments only take you so far. There needs to be political empowerment behind that. And if the political interest, the public interest is, oh, this is not acceptable, the likelihood that the senior management will move is bigger. Now, let me go on to the next question. That's here. That's Professor Pinincino, who teaches on gender issues in Johns Hopkins at SAIS Europe, has a question. Considering the development of gender risk assessment tools in World Bank project design and the adoption of a sense of requirements for contractors, now, would you say this could constitute a base for negligence legal actions at a domestic court? And she says, I'm thinking of the 2019 GEM versus IFC judgment by the US Supreme Court against the relevant, in this case, IFC or World Bank agency. Now, for the audience, let me just explain. There was a very prominent and shaking case which made in the United States on an Indian coal-based power plant, where a fishing community in India actually succeeded to bring a court case to the United States against IFC, arguing that fundamental rights were violated. And after some dispute, this case made it up to the Supreme Court, because the question was, can you even sue an international organization like the IFC? And the answer of the US Supreme Court for the United States says, yes, you can. Now, it's not so clear whether this is totally applicable for other institutions, but the question here is, since you have these risk assessment and it plays out in the public domain, could you imagine, Imrana, take on your lawyer's head, that a court case be brought to a national legal judicial system which actually argues there has been negligence?
Okay, so
yeah.
If immunity is lifted, meaning if the veil of immunity, they call it the veil of immunity, for international organizations like ourselves, the UN and so on, if we ever get to that stage, and I would question whether that we would in the short term get to that stage, then it is theoretically possible to file a court case in a domestic case. Because if we were to lose our immunity in Uganda, say, or in another country now, where we now have all these policies and guidelines and tools in place, could the World Bank be found to be negligent for not applying those tools? In the event that immunity is lifted, I would say it is possible. I would not say it's highly possible. I would say it's possible. In the same way that you sue corporations in your country which don't have immunity and privileges, right? So you can sue a private company for failing to comply with the standards, the labor standards in a country. Yes, you can. So in the same way, if our immunity was lifted, we would probably be able to be a defendant in a domestic court of law. But the immunity has to be lifted first. It's a very interesting question. It's a fascinating question. It really is. And as you can imagine, it's concerned the World Bank board for many, many months and close to 2 years, 3 years now.
It's a legal question, and I would like to go on to the next one. And the IFC case was more easy to lift the immunity because the IFC gives loans to the private sector, and under the U.S. international relations, anything commercial activities are not treated by the sovereign immunity. In the World Bank, it's going to be more tricky because those are sovereign loans. But we'll see. We were all very surprised that actually this case made it as far as it did and the attention it got. Now here we move on. Sneha from India, who was a second-year MIA student who actually writes her thesis on gender issues in India, asked a question on impacts of gender-biased violence on labor market access and performance, the role of women in the labor market, if there's a threat of gender-based violence in the labor market, and what are the impacts? Are there any measurements of the impacts on labor markets? And importantly, what kind of legislative tool can you see how gender-based violence in developing countries can be controlled or constrained by laws, by administrative processes, by sovereign actions?
Yeah, that's definitely worthy of a PhD analysis. And it might take just as long to explain, to answer that question, Sneha, which is an excellent question. But okay, so in a way, your larger question is, what role can legislation play, institutions play in reducing the possibility of gender-based violence on women who are participating in the labor market? Now, the law is an imperfect tool, right? The law, all legislation can do is put in place measures, criminal legislation, civil legislation, labor market regulations like ILO type regulations, to try to provide solutions to women who are victims of violence. At the same time, there is an ethical responsibility to try to make the labor market more gender inclusive, right? Because, look at the participation in the labor market of women in your country, Sneha. It's less than 30%. The same in my country. Now, this is so important. We know that women gain more autonomy the more access they have to their own independent income. If gender-based violence and sexual harassment is partially responsible for women not entering the labor market, that means that the country needs to institute national measures to make sure that women can participate in the labor market, and can also has laws, legislation, regulation, codes of conduct, policies and guidelines to ensure that the perpetrators behave themselves. So it's such a large question, it's almost impossible to give you a short answer. But there's been a lot of research done on this, and I would encourage you to have a look at the research. The Asian Development Bank has got some excellent publications on looking at gender equality in the labor market. They've done studies in Cambodia, in the Philippines, in China, and in Kazakhstan. And they've got publications on them. If you Google them, there's a section in those publications which talks about how there has to be national institutional policies and legislation to encourage more women to go into the labor market, the paid labor market.
Okay, and here I have a question from Andrea Gruggeri. Hi, I read it to you. Is there a specific clause in the World Bank agenda or strategy for women that live more levels of discriminations? For example, women with disabilities, trans women, lesbian women. Is there a guideline for a specific approach to women that live these further level of discriminations or violence? And then thank you for the presentation. It has been enriching and helpful.
I'm really happy that you enjoyed the presentation, Andrea. So let me answer that question in 3 ways. The first one is that many, many years ago, the inspection panel received its first complaint by a group of LGBTQI activists. And their organization is called the Blue Diamond Organization. Don't you just love that name? And they were based in Nepal. And the World Bank had a project in Nepal, a technical vocational education and training project. And we funded that. And when the advertisement went out to encourage young men and women, boys and girls to apply to participate in the project and the training, the advertisement went out from the Nepal government saying, men and women may apply to participate in the TVET project. Now, we don't know exactly what happened to cause this organization, the LGBTQI++, to file a complaint with us. We don't know whether somebody tried to apply to be involved in the project and were excluded, or from an ideological perspective, they were concerned about making a stand in terms of the way the advertisement was done on behalf of the project. So luckily, Birgit, who was one of our staff, who I think is here online, and a few others were in Nepal investigating another project. And when this complaint came to the panel, they spoke to the World Bank staff, and the World Bank intervened. And somebody had asked the question, how does the World Bank use its influence? The World Bank went to the Nepal government and said, it's not appropriate for you to exclude LGBTQI people. You need to change your advertisement to be more inclusive. So quite simply, just through the interference of the inspection panel and the World Bank staff, the advertisement was changed to any person may apply to participate in the project. Don't ask me why they didn't say that in the first place, but there you go. Maybe some of the Nepali language lost in translation. The second response to your excellent question, Andrea, is in the last few years, the World Bank has decided to tackle the whole issue of LGBTQI discrimination, in the sense that this group of vulnerable people cannot be excluded as project beneficiaries. So the first thing they did was they hired this person, and so we now have a very, very senior advisor on LGBTQI issues. I think it's called SOGI in the World Bank language, sexual orientation and gender identity. So we have a senior SOGI advisor, and the first step in dealing with this type of discrimination is to do a whole range of research, and that we are in the process of doing that. And trying to find entry points. How do we become more LGBT inclusive without violating their privacy and exposing them to more criminal activities and victimization or retaliation against them, right? Because remember, these people suffer an even greater level of discrimination than women, in the sense that for more than 2/3 of countries, it is a criminal offense still to be an LGBT person. So it's a very challenging thing to do. For example, we can't design a water project and say 1% of project beneficiaries have to be LGBTQI. We can say 30% of project beneficiaries must be women, but we can't say 1% or 10% must be LGBTQI, because it's a crime in that country. So you can see the development dilemma that the World Bank projects have in addressing this issue. Nevertheless, we are engaged in projects in Serbia, in India, and in 2 other countries, the names don't come to me immediately, where the SOGI advisor is doing research on housing to see how LGBT people are being excluded from housing, how they're being excluded from jobs. And so this information will give the World Bank the data and the statistics to enable us to address it in our project designs. One more thing. The SOGI project did this incredible research in India on the cost of LGBTQI exclusion. And it was done by this wonderful woman from Williams University, whose name, Professor Lee Paget. And her research basically informed the Indian government that the cost of LGBT exclusion in India is 0.2% of the GDP. So this was incredibly important information, and the Indian government received that research very well. Whether there will be a project out of it, that's open to question, but at least this has occurred. The third response is that the World Bank now has this new environmental and social framework, which became applicable to all projects developed after October 2018. And there are 10 or so standards in that environmental and social framework. Although there's no direct reference to LGBTQI people in the ESF, there are guidance notes about it, and the word discrimination is mentioned in it, and there is, I suppose it's a practice note, which has not been formally adopted by the board or formally adopted by the institution, but is in the process of being adopted. So the World Bank is attempting to tackle it. And many of the Part 1 countries, when I say Part 1 countries, I mean the donor countries that sit on the World Bank board, are very concerned, and they are trying to make sure that the World Bank becomes more LGBTQI friendly in terms of its projects.
Thank you. Now here's a question from Jenna Randolph, and I read it to you. Difficult question, Imrana. My name is Jenna, and I'm a PhD student in Innovative Finance and Global Health at University of Bologna. Thank you very much for this talk. I'm interested in learning more about the World Bank's efforts with violence against women as it relates to climate change.
Okay, so unfortunately, I can't answer that question directly because I don't work in the sort of operations of the World Bank. I work in the accountability for development, as you know. But what I can tell you is that the World Bank Gender Unit, which is run by Karen Groen, who's the Senior Advisor on Gender at the World Bank, they have a very targeted approach to looking at gender in climate change. Now, not necessarily gender-based violence in climate change, but gender in climate change. There's a strategy and approach to it. But within that, I do not see any reason why gender-based violence could not be a component of that. We all know, for example, that as a result of climate change, and I can tell you that in my region, which is the Pacific Island region, where the islands are extremely vulnerable to climate change and rising tides, king tides in Kiribati and so on, that the women who are victims of violence, that the context of gender-based violence is often connected to increased risk as a result of climate change. And we know that all the hurricanes and cyclones that are happening in the Pacific and what happens to women who are in the camps, in the camps, temporary housing and so on, because their homes have been devastated by the cyclones and hurricanes, we know that there's an extra vulnerability to gender-based violence in that context. And I've certainly seen it in two situations in my own country when there have been devastating hurricanes and cyclones in my country, and the increased risk, which we attribute to climate change, and the increased risk of gender-based violence in that context.
Okay, thank you, Imrana. We are coming towards the end of our discussion, and I will now give you another difficult question. You have done these, or the inspection panel has done these findings. You say the World Bank responded with a lot of different operational approaches, guidance notes, etc. Here's a case I some time ago had to deal with in one of the other mechanisms. In a small valley, in a mountainous region, in a country I will not name, 800 construction workers are to be placed there for a year of, not from the region, outside of the region, to build a hydro dam. there are only about 1,500 people living in that very narrow village. So the social impact assessment says, well, these workers will live in a work camp, and they will be told not to have any contact with local girls, and there will be security guards, but just in case they get out anyhow, we give them condoms. Now, somehow our panel didn't think this was an appropriate, sufficient, robust safeguard. Now, based on what you have found in your different, in the responses the World Bank has given you, how, just sort of synthesize how one should design a project where it is necessary to bring in a lot of non-residential workers for a longer period of time in a cohesive community. Maybe you can just name the 5 different most important measures which you would see.
Okay, so I'm assuming that the gender analysis and the social context has been well analyzed, and they're thinking of what gender design measures to put in place, right? Mm-hmm. So the first thing that I would do is I would make sure that the project has a gender-based violence action plan, right? Mm-hmm. And I would ensure that the men, the 1,500 men who are brought in to work for the contractor, all undergo training. And the training has to consist of gender awareness and, the risks of HIV and, both giving it and contracting it, right? And I would think that condoms are necessary. I mean, one can only do so much training. At the end of the day, human beings are human and they have frailties and so on and so forth. So I would consider the HIV training and the risk and the condom to be critical. The second thing I would do is I would make sure that the IFI spent a concentrated time doing training and awareness raising amongst the women of the village, right? So that means that I'm not talking just about a 1-hour seminar and, everybody knows about violence. I mean, we've seen that happening too, Anna, haven't we? Oh, we've tick box, we've done the training, we spent 1 hour telling the men not to go to the bars and not to engage in transactional sex with sex workers. It has to be concentrated training where you select people from the community to themselves become awareness raisers, to become community mobilizers, not just for the World Bank staff or the IFI to do the training, but we work with a local NGO to make sure that there is widespread awareness within the community. So that's the second thing. The third thing I would do, I would make sure that the project implementation unit has a GBV specialist or a gender specialist working there, not just 1 week every 2 months, but is located there and based there, and that she or he, mostly she, is constantly doing work in the community. So obviously you can't police people. Obviously there's going to be consensual relationships, right? I mean, that's human nature as well. So you have to allow for that. You have to accept that, unless of course it's a heavy duty country where the women are in parda, and then if you're engaging with them, you're likely to suffer serious consequences yourself. But in countries where women enjoy a degree of freedom, then you have to assume that there's going to be consensual sex occurring, whether it's consensual transactional commercial sex or just relationships between adults. Mm-hmm. So, you have to focus on things like it is illegal to have sex with a girl under 16, under any circumstances, whether she consents or not. And anyway, they can't give legal consent when they're under 16. So I would focus on schools. That's the fourth thing I would do. I would focus on schools. I would make sure that the supervision of the project is closely done, and that the staff that are sent out to monitor whether the gender-based violence action plan is being implemented have a specific reporting on that element alone. Mm-hmm. That's the fifth thing I would do. And the sixth thing, I can't think of it.
Well, we would surely put in place a grievance mechanism and make sure that it's actually taken seriously and look at it and empower it so that it's considered. I mean, we come back to Zachary's first question. So that's not just a token thing that this is meant to be serious. You should use it. It's authorized, it's empowered. And you know, if we think there's evidence for wrongdoing, something will happen because this will actually lead to enforcement. I mean, that would
absolutely. And I mean, yes, that is absolutely critical that there's a project.
That's how we started this. This was the first question. Well, on this note, let me thank you for all your presentation, for your discussions. Thanks so much for making time available on this important topic. I do think this will be an agenda which will stay with us in the development field for some time. There's many more cases than we know about, obviously. It's only now that they emerge to the accountability mechanisms. Imrana started our discussion with this. So as you know, as we have seen, we have had cases at Oxfam, at World Life Fund. These were very prominent in Europe. So I'm sure there are other cases. So yes, it's time that these institutions actually think about how one can safeguard it by proper gender policies, by proper institutional policies, by being publicly authorized, because it does play out in the public domain. And in this case, I think it's a very good thing because it also leads to empowerment. So thank you so much to you, Imrana, for sharing your experience with us. And thank you also for all the excellent work of the inspection panel on this very important topic.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you again for inviting me. My thanks go to Alessandro and the others at Johns Hopkins. Thank you for the privilege of allowing me to speak to your students.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you very much.